Well, Songs of the Great Lakes followers, we have a very, very special guest with us today. We have the president of the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association, Mr. Brendon Baillod, with us today. And I would love you guys to give him a warm welcome. Mr. Brendon, I thank you very much for joining us on this episode today.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
If you don't mind, would you give our listeners some introductions as to who you are and kind of what you've been a part of and anything you feel free to share about yourself?
That's a long story, I guess, but because I do a lot of work in a lot of different areas of Great Lakes maritime history, shipwreck exploration, things like that. So I guess I'll start from the beginning. I'm from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, from the Copper Country, and I grew up there on the Keweenaw Waterway. We had a few shipwrecks off the house, and I used to snorkel them when I was a little kid and take the fishing lures off of them and take them into town and sell them for $1 a piece. And eventually I got to wondering, what were those ships? What were they doing there? Nobody knew what they were. They were like these old wooden boats that, are 150 feet long and just seemed to come out of nowhere. And eventually, when I was a teenager, I went to the local historical archive and started to research them a little bit. And even they didn't know what they were. And I had to go into the newspaper microfilms. I found out they were some of the most historic vessels on Lake Superior, and they had been abandoned there. And eventually, when I got older, I got scuba certified and started diving on them with, some of my partners, my mentors at the time, people like Dan Fountain and Randy Beebe, Kirk Fosberg, some of the early divers up there. And we measured them and identified them. And I eventually wrote articles about them for the local paper, and it was sort of the beginning of catching the bug, if you will. Because the Keweenaw waterway is just filled with shipwrecks. It's an underwater museum, because of the old mining area. Eventually, I got involved in the early Michigan Underwater Preserve movement, and in the Keweenaw Underwater Preserve, which is largely a paper park today. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea right after the Mesquite wrecked up there. So that had been in the late 80s. Eventually, moved to Wisconsin because you have to get a job. You don't really have a lot to do up there in the UP. And I got very involved in a couple of groups down here. The Wisconsin Marine Historical Society. I did. I was a paid volunteer for them in their archive for quite a while, and I continued to dive down here. I think it was about 2000 or so. Some buddies and I wanted to, start a shipwreck show, a festival, because we like going to the Gales of November conference up in Duluth. So we founded the Ghost Ships Festival in Milwaukee in 2000 and started the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Foundation. And it was a group that held this big festival. It got bigger and bigger every year. By 2015, I think we were getting 1,000 people and had like 80 booths. And um, it kind of collapsed under its own weight. Now we've restarted it again in Manitowoc. In fact, it's coming up March 6th and 7th. It'll be the 17th, I think, Great Lakes Ghost Ships Festival. And you can buy tickets to it at ghostshipsfestival.com. If you're in Wisconsin, join us for it. We will be unveiling a newly discovered shipwreck. There's been a new major passenger steamer shipwreck discovery in Lake Michigan. And it's going to be announced this week and a national press release. And then the discoverer will be presenting it at the Ghost Ships Festival. So if you want to find out about this, and it's a major discovery, so come to the Ghost Ships Festival. I'll stop there. I can carry on a little bit more about other things I do, but I'll let you interject a question.
Oh yeah, perfect introductions. That gives everybody an idea of what you're about, what you're part of. I love it. I love every single bit of it.
Well,
So
there's a lot more than that. I mean, in addition to that, I do a lot of work with underwater archaeology. So I became involved in preservation, not just from the standpoint of for sport diving. I'm not much of a sport diver anymore. I was when I was young, visiting the tourist wrecks and the preserves, but I look for shipwrecks a lot, and I found quite a few. I think I found 5 major shipwrecks in the last 3 years that are now on the National Register of Historic Places. So some of these are deep wrecks, like the Trinidad is in 265 feet of water. Um, but really, and I think you know this, my real passion is research and antiquities. So if you look behind me, this is not a backdrop. This is my library I'm sitting in. I've got the largest private collection of Great Lakes maritime history books, maps, photos, and ephemera. Probably the largest private collection in the world. I've been doing this now for a better part of 40 years. And a lot of these are leather bound histories, of Great Lakes port cities and counties. A lot of them, I've got the full run of the annual list of U.S. merchant vessels from 1867 to 1994. I can look up any ship on the Great Lakes and trace its whole career right here in the library. I don't need to leave. Downstairs, I've got every book ever written about Great Lakes shipwrecks, all the old field reports, lots of things from the 60s and 70s that are really rare and lightly circulated. So basically, I can lay my hands on just about any shipwreck information. But the other thing that have done is a lot of electronic online database and digitization. So about 30 years ago, I started working with a group of Great Lakes maritime historians. It was led by David Swayze to make a database of every known commercial loss to a ship on the Great Lakes. And then we did this through primary, source, original research, right? Not like reading Fred Stonehouse books. Not anything against Fred, but we went back to the news microfilms and to the original wreck reports and things like that. And it took us about 15 years to reach a critical mass, but the database now stands at around 6,000 shipwrecks. Everything from modern ships that were burnt, that were lost in a fire, to really early ships, from the 1820s, 1830s that just vanished without a trace. We verified, where these ships, when they were built, that they were really on the lakes, and then, if they were, removed or not, things like that. So this database, kind of fed into more work where I went through the database and took out all the wrecks that were known to have been lost or known to have been found, right? And I also took out the wrecks that were lost by going ashore or on reefs, or were in a harbor somewhere. And that left me with only the undiscovered wrecks that are still out in deep water. So I did a series of programs called Lost Leviathans on Great Lakes Now about the ships that are still missing. And there are about 217 ships still missing on Lake Michigan. And I went through those and identified the ones I want to look for. And the top four, I went out and we found them. The last one we found, the schooner F.J. King, we did it as a public history project. So that was really cool. And I'll talk about that later. But so, I do a bunch of stuff. I help digitize historical materials that researchers use. I just found a big trove of over 8,000 Customs House shipwreck reports at the National Archives in Chicago that no one knew were there. These are reports written out by the captain of each vessel for every accident between the Western Lakes between about 1870 and 1930. And they were in these old rotting leather binders, and I secured permission from the National Archives to digitize them. And through the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History, another group that I belong to, we digitized all 8,000 of them. And I'll be honest with you, 3 of those 4 shipwrecks I found, I couldn't have found them without what was in those reports. So it's not always, finding a shipwreck doesn't always involve looking in the sources that already exist. Sometimes it involves finding sources that nobody knew existed.
And that's one
Yeah.
of the questions we get to later is extremely interesting to me because I didn't even think of that aspect of pre-homework before even getting out on a boat onto the lake and looking in the general area. But first, before we get to that, so you and I have a mutual friend. I'm sure everybody knows him, the one and only Rick Mixter, which I am very, very thankful that he connected us. You guys have long history, not only you and Rick Mixter, but also Ken Merriman and Jerry Elizen. Would you briefly just tell us your work with Rick and Ken and Jerry? Because then we'll get into some of our first wrecks that you guys kind of got to.
Well, we're all old Lake Superior guys. Rick's a Youper from Marquette, right? And so we were a natural fit. We're around the same age. And I got to know Ken and Jerry just because I go to Isle Royal every year since I was a little kid, right? And Ken Merriman's kind of a legend up there. And we eventually met at the Gales of November conference up in Duluth, and we got to be really good friends. And this was many years ago, and probably in the 80s is when I met those guys. But Rick and I had a number of things that we were interested in mutually, right? And he knew me for my research abilities, and I knew him because he's human crazy glue. I call him the golden retriever of Great Lakes maritime historians. He's just so friendly and such a good speaker. And we just hit it off. If you watch, Rick just did a wonderful documentary with me called Keweenaw from Copper to Chryslers, and we went up there and tried to find some of the copper ingots on the bottom of the Keweenaw waterway, and we went out and located the sites of the wrecks of the Altadoc and city of Bangor. We explored the old dredge there in Torch Lake. It's a great documentary. But Rick and I, not many people know this. He saved my life. We did an ill-advised shore dive one time in Milwaukee. He was interested in Davidson's Goliaths, the big 300-foot wooden ships that James Davidson built at Bay City, because Rick had a long tenure at Bay City. Well, the Appomattox is probably the biggest wooden ship ever built on the Great Lakes, and she's wrecked at Milwaukee in fairly shallow water. Some say she's a shore dive. So she's off Atwater Beach, and you have to go down this big thing of switchbacks. It's really, really far. And we had to carry all our gear down there. And I was a bit overweighted, but we decided we were going to do it. We get down to the beach. We swim out to the wreck, which turns out to be much further than I thought. It ain't really a shore dive, especially not after traversing those switchbacks. Luckily, I'm a young man. Well, so I do this all the time when I shore dive. Probably why I shouldn't do it. I save enough air to get to the surface, but not enough to get to shore. And I get out there and I'm realizing when I get up to the surface that I'm not going to be able to swim back to shore on the surface. And I don't really have the air to get back. And I start freaking out and panicking. And luckily, Rick came up right about that time and helped me into shore. And we kind of buddy swam in for like, oh God, what's 300 yards at least. So you can imagine that. And, so thank you, Rick, for that.
Yeah, thank
Ken and,
goodness.
yeah, Ken and Jerry and Craig Smith too, who was one of their wreck hunting partners. I've done a lot of work with them. Shipwreck hunting up on Lake Superior. We've gone out together. Ken and I went out to the Fox Islands, in northern Lake Michigan, and we surveyed a number of wrecks out there and dived them and did photogrammetry on them a couple of years ago. Most notably, probably was when we went out, right after I got done with the Foxes, he invited me to come out with him to look for the Paramarquette 18. And I was like, well, I really didn't really want to. First of all, I didn't believe that they could find it because I've been on 3 different expeditions to find the Paramarquette 18. And when you get out there, that's a big lake. And there weren't a lot of clues about the PM18. I mean, we knew a 10 mile by 10 mile grid maybe, but that's just huge. And I also had, spent a whole week on the Hey Boy, sweating and bouncing around out in big waves. And I just didn't have the stomach for it. So they went out there, and I'll be damned, he calls me up and says, we found it. I'm like, oh. So he immediately invites me out to go and drop the camera on it, right? And I kind of read between the lines. The reason I was invited was largely because those are 2 78-year-old guys, and I'm young. I'm a young, strong guy that can pull on the cable, right? But I go, because why not, right? We get out there and we start drifting over with Jerry Eliason's, sort of homemade drop cam, which is a big thing, right? Heavy. And it's on a big winch system, like that they made themselves with a huge barrel made of PVC pipe with a handle on it. And you got to crank that thing up. And as you're drifting at the wreck, you want to raise it real quick if you see the wreck, because you don't want to hang on it. And the Paramarquette 18, my God, it is just got hands and claws reaching out, lifeboat davits, torn pieces of railing. I mean, if you want to lose your ROV, that's the wreck to do it on. Anyway, so we get out there and we're drifting over it, and all of a sudden, no warning, whoom, big side of a shipwreck right on the camera, and we hit it. And suddenly the ROV starts dragging, scraping up the side of the wreck, not an ROV, but the camera. And I'm like reeling for all my life, and then scratch, it just catches on this big claw of a railing that's ripped out. And Ken throws it into reverse to try to keep this, so we don't lose the whole get up. And it's on this stand on the back of the boat. And so I grab the stand thinking, okay, if it goes over, I'll go over with it because I'm wearing a life jacket and I can keep it from going to the bottom. I rethink that quickly because I realize that it's heavy enough to pull me down with a life jacket on. So just as I'm about to let go of it, the PVC drum implodes inward and shards of PVC go flying everywhere. That's enough. The slack that created was enough that the boat's momentum caught up and nothing went overboard. Well, of course, me being the young guy, and I end up pulling the cable for 2 hours. There's 600 feet of cable out. We got it up, covered with rust, which I promptly took and dabbed with a paper towel. So I have rust from the Paramount Kid 18. But yeah, they're great guys, and I regularly do work with them. I really am impressed with Ken's work doing photogrammetry. The WUAA, the group that I am currently the president of, we just chartered or gave them a grant to do photogrammetry work on a few of our wrecks here in Wisconsin, and they did a wonderful job. They're coming back to do some more work next year, so we're happy to support them.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, you can't ever beat those personal stories of being there and instances like that. Just that's the best. You can't pay for that. That's perfect. I love those.
Yeah, it was quite an experience. There, it's always an experience with them. You gotta like oldies music if you go out on the hay boy with them, though. It's constant 1950s, early 60s oldies, which I like honestly. But after 3 or 4 days, it
You
does
starts wearing on you.
doo-wop music.
Oh boy. Well, sweet. Well then, I do. Would you rather share a bit more on the Pure Marquette 18, or we could go to the LR Doty and the Olive Jeanette? What do you think you would feel stronger talking about?
Well, I'll just close up about the 18 and then I'll move on.
Okay.
One of the interesting things about the 18 is that I've been on that wreck, out to that wreck, I should say, probably more than anybody, including Ken and Jerry, because I constantly go out. Well, we're looking for another wreck in that area, and we use that as a truthing target. What we do is we run by it at about 1,000 feet away and make sure that we can see it and test how the seeing is. So I probably side scanned the Paramount Kid 18, like a dozen times, just seeing it. And when we've been out there, one of the things we found in that area are these huge craters on the bottom of Lake Michigan. They're big. Some of them are a quarter mile across, and they have a big lip around them, like an annulus. And the bottom of the craters are disturbed, like not smooth, like the lake bottom around them. And I reported those to NOAA. And of course, they went out and tried to claim credit for it immediately, even though I called up, I emailed the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory and reported these craters to them. And they were calling them sinkholes, which is ridiculous. The bottom is not limestone there. The bottom is deep loam that's at least 40 feet deep. We know because the Paramount Kid 18 is stabbed into the bottom at least 40 feet down into the loam. It's a heavy clay, kind of like what you make pottery out of. Anyway, these craters are probably most scientists think they're caused by off gassing of volatile hydrocarbons under the lake bed. So kind of what happens up in the Arctic right now when frozen methane starts to sublimate and explodes up through the permafrost. The lake is heating up, and we're seeing these big craters, and they're younger than the last glaciation. They've got to be under 11,000 years old because the glacier scoured the bottom of the lake. So these are modern, fairly modern geobiological features. But yeah, we found these cool craters and it made some national news. They're right out in that area, 500 feet deep. But yeah, you mentioned the LR Doty and the Olive Jeanette. That was a big chapter in my life. It all started up in the copper country when I was
Yeah,
young.
Mr. National Geographic, incredible.
Yeah, that was quite an event in my life. I had a friend, Art Lassinen, who was a commercial fisherman out of Little Traverse Bay up there. He's since recently deceased, just in the last 5 years. Great guy, really easygoing, mild mannered fella. And him and his dad, Art Sr., had been commercial fishermen up in the Keweenaw since the 1920s. And Art told me the damnedest story. He said that they were out off the Huron Islands in 1954 and they brought up a human skeleton in their nets out of 300 feet of water. And they said they recovered the skull. The rest of it fell out. But they got the skull. And they sent it to the state crime lab in Lansing. Well, I'm like, this is a pretty big story. Then he pulled up the news clip about it from the Daily Mining Gazette, and I was like, holy smokes, this is true. And he told me that the state crime lab down in Lansing said it was a woman's skull that had been on the bottom of the lake for about 50 years. Um, well, we thought, well, I asked Art, do you remember where that was? And he kind of knew of the rough area. And eventually, we went out there, and lo and behold, there's a huge ship on the bottom. It was the schooner Olive Jeanette, which was originally built as a big four-masted schooner. It was broken pretty badly because it was carrying iron ore. And so when it sank, its bow hit bottom. It sank in the big storm in 1905. It had been being towed by the steamer Iosco, which is still missing up there. The Iosco cut her free and turned back towards Marquette, but the Olive Jeanette went and sailed on towards the south entry to the Keweenaw and was never seen again. So there she was, kind of solved that mystery a little bit, but we never told anybody because there are a few competing groups that didn't want it released. Technical divers, kind of were using it as a private playground. Eventually, we decided to release it because we found a second part of the story. So that was in 1905 that the Olive Jeanette was lost. But if you turn back time to 1898, the Olive Jeanette was involved in another big harrowing shipwreck, this time on Lake Michigan. She was being towed by the steamer L.R. Doty, and she was off Milwaukee in a giant storm that was actually started as a hurricane, the one that destroyed Galveston. It came up through the Great Lakes, and they didn't know it. The weather forecasting wasn't great, and it hit them. There was a woman cook on the Olive Jeanette. Her name was Frankie Waters, and she was the last person ever to see the L.R. Doty because their tow line broke off Milwaukee, according to her. And everybody had thought the Doty was off Kenosha because that's where they found her wreckage, but this woman cook gave a riveting account to the local Chicago papers after they rescued her. She, after the tow line broke, the Olive Jeanette's masts were swept overboard, her pilot house was swept overboard, and this woman and the captain lashed themselves to the steering wheel. And they were picked up that way 36 hours later off Chicago with severe hypothermia. And this woman gave a riveting account to the local Chicago papers. And she said, we last saw the lights of the L.R. Doty. We could see we were off Milwaukee. We could see the lights of Milwaukee. And she steamed off into the distance, and we lost view of her lights. And we knew, she said exactly what course they were on, right, where they were heading. So, I drew the course and I made a search grid around it and did some analysis. And I realized that, my friend Jerry Geyer had a snag out there that a fisherman had given to him 20 years earlier. And Jerry wasn't too concerned about or interested in it because he was a dive charter captain, and that was in 300 feet of water, 18 miles from shore. So he didn't really ever look at it, but he said, what, you should, I'll give you the numbers. You guys should go take a look at it. And lo and behold, we went out there, and it was the L.R. Doty. Big 300-foot wooden steamer laying upright and intact on the bottom. So I did a press release about this, and which I do when we find a new shipwreck because we want to tell its story and use it as a way of interesting people in Great Lakes maritime history. And National Geographic called me up, and I told them this story about the two shipwrecks. And I said, it's really kind of compelling because this woman's account helped us find the L.R. Doty. Her skull helped us find the Olive Jeanette. And, she was a tough woman. I did some background searching on her. She was from Grand Haven, Michigan, and worked on the boats all her life as a cook. And, there were a lot of women that were recruited to do that back in that day. And a lot of them don't get any credit, about how many women there were that sailed on the lakes. But the documentary went through and explored these wrecks. We put together a dive team, and I helped co-produce it. We had 2 film crews and 2 dive, boats. Yitka Hanakova and Shipwreck Explorers. We went out and did the L.R. Doty, and it was Dan Fountain and a crew from Minnesota that came out along with my dad and his big boat from the Copper Country, and we did the Olive Jeanette. We put dive teams down on both of the wrecks, and I'll tell you a creepy story that didn't make it into the film, and because we wouldn't have shown it, but down in the engine room of the L.R. Doty, one of the divers saw a skeletal hand reaching up out of the mud.
Really?
Yeah. Now, before I go and look for a wreck like that, or in the case of the L.R. Doty, go out to survey it, I actually do genealogy on people because I'm a big genealogy buff. And I'll go on to Ancestry and I'll build a family tree for the people that died on the ship, or the captain or people like that. And I'll find living descendants and I'll reach out to them. And we did that. And we had about 6 or 7 living descendants of L.R. Doty victims that came to Milwaukee for our big presentation about it. And we've done that for a lot of our wrecks. So yeah, the documentary came out, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago. They still air it once in a while, but it was a lot of fun to make. And I thought Nat Geo did a really good job. I've done other things with the History Channel, the Discovery Channel. I did an episode of Deep Sea Detectives. I did 2 episodes, and then I did an Expedition Unknown episode with Josh Gates about the Griffin. I thought they could have done a little bit better with those. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the reality TV shows because I think they try to sensationalize
Yeah.
the history instead of telling it straight, right? So, yeah, that was a big episode in my life, and a lot of people helped me with that. We had, too numerous to name, but Yitka, Dan Fountain, Jay Hansen from, Duluth. I mean, there were just a ton of people who really stepped up to help that get made.
Yeah, I mean, why sensationalize it? It's interesting as can be already on its own, and imagine if that skull hadn't have been found, or that how it was, the body or whatever, like, that wouldn't have led all the other series of events into what it became, you know?
Well, storytelling's a bit of an art. Being able to draw that arc together between the Olive Jeanette and the L.R. Doty and that woman Cook, who they shared in common, and her role in it. I mean, that was something that that story would have probably never been noticed or told. You know, and I was able to kind of put that narrative together for them, and it made a good documentary, I think.
No, absolutely, and I'm all about lesser known wrecks getting their due told, and, I love the Fitzgerald, we all know it and love it, but there are how many others, Brandon, that need to be told and discovered, and the genealogy, like you're saying, for descendants.
Yeah, there's so many. There are about 215 ships still missing on Lake Michigan that haven't been found. There's about half that on Lake Huron. And the reason there's only half that on Lake Huron is one person, Dave Trotter. He's found, and when I did my Lost Leviathans episode for Lake Huron, I actually sent him my list, and he sent me back corrections. About 15 of them had already been found by himself or other people. And when I added up the list of how many Dave found, it was well over 100. So when Dave says he's found over 100 shipwrecks, he's not just gilding the lily; they're real serious finds. And the reason is that Dave doesn't do what I do. Like when I look for a shipwreck, I pick one, I research it, I go out and grid. Dave goes out and just covers bottom around the shipping lanes, in areas where he knows there's likely shipwrecks. And that in Lake Huron works because that was a lake that was a transit lake, right? There are no big port cities on Lake Huron. If you're on Lake Huron in a commercial vessel, it's because you're going from another lake to another lake. So if you follow the shipping lanes, you're going to find a lot of shipwrecks. And that's what Dave's done. You got to give it to him. He's been doing this since the '70s, and Dave's in his '80s now. So what a contribution he's made.
Oh, yeah, and he just had a tremendous find with the Carruthers not that long ago, too.
He certainly did. Biggest ship still missing on the Great Lakes, and rewrote the history. It was not in Canadian waters like everyone thought. It was in American waters, and it turns out everyone had been kind of giving wrong information about where she was bound. She wasn't bound for Georgian Bay. She was actually bound down for Lake Erie port. So yeah, tremendous contribution.
Um, well then, I love how you describe how David goes about his way, which works perfect with, Lake Huron. But I loved how you said, like, you will go and do all this good research beforehand, that, I pick a wreck, and then you go through the reports that the captains would write back then, or you would, maybe eyewitnesses or statements like that. So could you kind of tell us the ins and outs of looking for wrecks, kinda what you do, if you want, and then, if there's any other wrecks you wanna bring up that coincides with that, please do.
Well, I guess I can tell you the story of how we found some of the wrecks because it'll give you a good view of how the sausage is made, so to speak,
Okay.
using our methodology. So if you're looking for a wreck on Lake Michigan, there are a lot of shipping lanes because there are a lot of ports, and so they could kind of be anywhere unless it's like a steamer on a known course. Um, let's talk first about the tug John Evanson. So we found that last year at the end of the year. It had been missing and searched for many years. There was a $500 reward for its discovery. The Evanson was just north of Algoma, Wisconsin, and it was hit by the big steamer called the I. Watson Stevenson. It rolled under her hull actually and went right to the bottom. On the news, there's lots of newspaper articles about it, and the owners, the Lurie brothers from Sturgeon Bay, kind of didn't want her to be found, so they gave all these conflicting stories, like, oh, she's in 300 feet of water, or she was, 8 miles from shore, or 125 feet of water. There's all sorts of speculation, all sorts of articles, and nobody could really kind of narrow it down. The search grid was going to be huge for that thing, and this is one where we went to the Customs House Rec report, and that's still not public. You still can't just access it, right? I mean, those rec reports have been digitized, but we're still making the finding database for them and working with the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History on a project to do that. But so we had the rec report, and in that, the captain and the owners were fairly straightforward. They didn't gild the lily at all. They gave a distance from Algoma. The grid turned out to be pretty, not tiny. I mean, it was about 2 miles by 2 miles, but that's not a big grid in shipwreck hunting terms. But when you're looking for a little tug that's probably broken up, 2 miles by 2 miles is pretty big, because a big Klein side scan sonar shooting 1,000 feet per channel, you're not going to see that wreck. What you need is an archaeological sonar. I happen to have one. I'm the U.S. representative for deep vision sonars out of Linköping, Sweden. And I've worked with Uffe Langstrom there for years. And I have 2 deep vision sonars. I have a deep vision little eye, which is a short cable, 60-foot cable model, high frequency, that we use for archaeological surveys of things we already know are there. And then we have their deep eye, which is a 600-foot cable, bigger sonar, lower frequency, that we can use to search further out. And then we have a homemade sonar that kind of uses the traditional Great Lakes wreck hunter model. For those of you who don't know, most Great Lakes wreck hunters who don't have a towfish sonar will just go and buy a Garmin 94 SV, and they'll take and make a towfish and put the GT51M transducer on the towfish, buy the extender cable kit, and make a 60-foot cable, and they'll run that below the surface. The reason you need to you don't want to run that transducer on the hull of the boat, you want to get it below the surface, is you want to get below the turbulence on the surface, right? And it also eliminates having a hot channel from the boat leaning one way or the other. The other thing that it does, in theory, is it gets you below warm water on the surface, but not too well. You really need a long cable model if you're going to be searching in the late summer when there's hot, very warm water on the surface, because the acoustical signature will bounce right off that water, and there'll be turbulence. You'll see it. It's like being in the desert when you look through the air in the desert and you see all those waves from the heat. There's a similar phenomenon in the water, and those waves will keep you from seeing shipwrecks out after maybe only 300-400 feet. So you have to know what sonar to use and when to use it. For this case, for the Evanson, we were using the little eye. We got out there to the grid, and usually what I do to prepare a grid is I'll open up Google Earth, I'll take and measure distances and put pins in on Google Earth with coordinates, and I'll make a box, right? We drive out to the box. And now what I'll also do is I'll lay a transparency sometimes with a historical map from the period when the ship was lost, and I'll lay a bathymetric map of the bottom, usually one of the NOAA bottom map charts that are really high resolution, so I can see what all the depths are at those points. So we got out there, and the depth was way off. We were about 15 feet too shallow for where we really wanted, or too deep for where we wanted to be. So I told my partner Bob Jake, I said, we need to correct this now, and we'll do this a lot. Like if we go out and the grid isn't what we thought when we laid it out, we'll dynamically change the grid right on the spot. So we picked another point that we immediately triangulated that was going to be a 1/4 mile closer to shore and a 1/2 mile further south. So we had the towfish in the water, and it takes a while for the time varied gain on the side scan sonar to heat up so that you're getting good seeing. So we had the sonar in the water, we were tuning it, we're heading for the new mark. 5 minutes in, we run over the John Evanson.
Wow.
Huge boiler on the bottom. You clearly see the condenser on top. When we put the ROV down there, you could see it all. The whole drivetrain of that propeller is still intact. The this tug, the big propellers there. It's really an interesting study in early Great Lakes steam tugs because she was built like in the 1870s, so pretty early vessel, and an interesting old steam engine. It's all intact. But that's how we did it, right? And those are a couple of good points to know about wreck hunting for a shallow target. She was only in 50 feet of water. Is that having the right sonar for that is helpful, and we had it only on about a 300 foot per channel range. So she looked like a rock when we ran her over, but she looked like a rock that was absolutely shaped like a mailbox. So that's one of the ways we wouldn't have seen her on the
Mhm.
big sonar. Another good illustrative point is probably the wreck of the FJ King that we just found. So we did that as a public history project through WUA. Um, I picked it, and instead of just going out and looking for it with Bob, I said, let's bring people with us. Let's share the experience, right? And so we put together a WUA project. We got a state archaeological permit to look for it because we share our information with the state here in Wisconsin. Because they do a lot of work to help us. They do the photogrammetry models. They put it, and they release all the numbers. If you go to wisconsinshipwrecks.org, the state's archaeological program site for Wisconsin shipwrecks, every discovered shipwreck in Wisconsin is up there with its numbers if you want to visit it.
Mm.
See if you've got Michigan. Michigan doesn't do anything like that. Wisconsin, every shipwreck in the state that's been found has been publicized by the state archaeological program. Not and we do it after we survey them, right? After we know that there are, there's they're not sensitive for divers to visit, right? But that's real kudos to our state program. And anyway, so we decided to do this search for the FJ King, and many people had searched for it. It had been looked for 30 years by dozens of wreck hunters. Some of them were friends of mine, and there was $1,000 reward for her discovery. One of the things that really moved it up, sort of the ladder in my priorities and to finding it is an article I found, a news article. Everybody kind of knew that its masts had been breaking the surface when it was lost, and that the lighthouse keeper at Canna Island Lighthouse there up in Door County had seen those masts, and he asked the revenue cutter service to send a revenue cutter to take them off because he said they were in the shipping lane and a hazard. But he never said like exactly where they were. At least that's what it looked like. People had actually gotten the logs of the revenue cutter that came out there, and there was no evidence, I mean, that they ever found the wreck. When the revenue cutter came to remove the mast, they were gone.
Hmm.
It's like the ship vanished. She was kind of a ghost ship, if you will, And then everybody looked for her for years in this little grid where the lighthouse keeper said she was, where the wreck report said she was, and they never found her. She was literally like a ghost ship. What I found an account in a local paper that nobody had seen, and the lighthouse keeper gave exact bearings and distances to the masts.
Wow.
So I thought, I don't approach that like, oh, we're going to go out and get it, right? The way to approach that, because I can't tell you how many times I found accounts giving bearings and distances to masts, and you go out there and there ain't nothing. The way we approach it is we need to eliminate that as a possibility, right? And that's kind of how we approach all our searches. We're going to knock off this bottom area and take that out of the equation. So we know it's not there. That's important intellectual property, important knowledge where the wreck isn't. So we went out there and we chartered the Shoreline, a big charter boat, and we brought 20 WUA members out. And they got to see how the sausage was made. They got to operate the side scan. We all watched as the bottom crawled by. We were on our second pass of the first day, and the wreck crawled across the screen. It was less than half a mile from where the lighthouse keeper said he saw the masts. Yeah, they were the first humans to lay eyes on that ship since 1881. We immediately anchored and flew the ROVs down, and it was amazing to see this big hull come into view. A few weeks later, we went down with the State Historical Society and did a 3D photogrammetry model of the FJ King. It's a perfectly intact wreck, but it's in 100 to 150 feet of water is what I'll say for now, because we haven't released the location yet. But we will be releasing the location as soon as it goes on the National Register of Historic Places. We're planning on doing that very soon. In fact, the hearing for it I think is in a couple of weeks. And then I think we're going to release the location at the Ghost Ships Festival
Wow.
this year for divers who want to visit her. But that's a good illustrative point also in how you have to do the research. And, many people had looked for her and hadn't found her. And I wouldn't say, you could say I got lucky, but I'll preface it like this. I'll say, I've been doing original research into shipwrecks for 40 years. And I mean serious stuff where I write articles. I've got books that I've written, my book Fathoms Deep, about all the shipwrecks in southeastern Wisconsin, or my book about Oceana County, Pentwater, Michigan, Ghosts of the Oceana Coast, which I published last year. There were many of those 60 some wrecks in that book that no one knew about before I wrote the book, because I just literally did a survey of every ship that was lost in Oceana County waters. I came up with a lot of new ones that no one had heard of. And my point being that I know of a lot of resources that maybe other people don't think of, just because I've used so many resources. And sitting here in my library, I'm looking at, the full run of Beeson's Marine Directory with their annual rec list, and the full run of the annual reports of the U.S. Life Saving Service, which all their rec lists. And I've got all the rec reports from the Board of Lake Underwriters, the Inland Lloyds, the insurance company consortium on the Great Lakes from the 1800s. All these kind of things are all pieces of the puzzle. And knowing about them and having easy access to them is important, which is one of the reasons why I think I've had a fair amount of success finding these sort of wrecks that require research, and a lot of our Lake Michigan wrecks do. So that's kind of how the sausage is made, I guess.